can begin.
Thank you. I'd like to call the June 23rd, 2022 Health and Human Services Committee meeting to order. Madam Clerk, please call the roll.
Alderwoman Green.
Present.
Alderman Gunther.
Here.
Alderwoman Middlebrook. Alderwoman Rice. Alderman Todd.
Present.
Chairwoman Negracia.
Present.
For present, you have quorum.
Thank you. The next item on the agenda is approval of the minutes from the May 12th, 2022 committee meeting. I would entertain a motion to pass those out.
I make a motion to approve the minutes from the, did you say May 22nd meeting?
Second.
I'm sorry, was that May 12th?
May 12th meeting, sorry.
Thank you.
Second.
Madam Clerk, please call the roll.
Alderwoman Green.
Aye.
Alderman Gunther.
Aye.
Vice Chair Middlebrook. Alderwoman Rice. Alderman Todd.
Present.
Chairwoman Negracia.
Aye.
3 aye votes and 1 voted present.
Thank you very much.
Oh, I'm sorry. I made a mistake. Sorry, I've been. I was thinking about President. I thought you were doing roll call. I was thinking about roll call for. I thought you were. I was thinking about roll call. I'm voting to accept the minutes.
Thank you.
Sorry
That's
for the mistake.
no problem. 4 aye votes, Madam Chair.
Thank you. By your vote, you have approved the minutes to the May 12th, 2022 committee meeting. And now we can move on to Board Bill 11. Alderwoman Green, would you mind taking over the meeting since I'm going to be presenting the bill?
Sure, not a problem at all.
Am I okay to proceed?
Yes, please proceed.
So Board Bill 11 is authorizing the Department of Health to accept a grant from the Missouri Department of Health and Human Services for about $1.3 million. And the bulk of that money is going to be used for purchasing 50,000 2-pack at-home COVID-19 testing kits and for the distribution of those, along with education and training for the most vulnerable populations in the city, identified by key zip codes of need. And there are a few other items that the grant will cover. I have connected with the health department online, and if you think it's appropriate, I'll have him speak and then the committee can ask questions.
All right, go right ahead.
Great. Good afternoon. Thank you so much. Much appreciated. I think the sponsor really covered it. It is at its base an opportunity for us to get 50,000 of those 2-pack at-home antigen tests. We would likely be working again through our federally qualified health centers, probably through clergy and others, putting together some stakeholder groups who already sort of exist, right? For some of the COVID, which still exists for us, and then collaborating with the Missouri Center for Public Health Excellence. It talks about a community health assessment, which we are in the midst of right now, so we really don't have any additional burden put on us as a result of that. And obviously, we're trying to work with folks who want to have an opportunity to have these tests available for their use, in addition to some of the other education that we're providing for people to remain safe as we go forward with COVID remaining with us.
All right, I will now entertain questions from the committee. Alderman Gunther, any questions?
No questions. Thank you.
Alderman Todd, any questions? You're muted.
Sorry, Madam Chair. Thank you. No questions.
All right. I just have one question. Do we know, once we purchase these tests, do we know how long they are good for? And are we going to be purchasing them in a like a rolling basis or 50,000 at once?
Yeah, so I was actually thinking about that, Alderwoman, earlier today, and we'll obviously take our charge from Dr. Mahdi. My guess would be that we're probably going to have to get these in some lots. In the past, we've done some of this with staff, as you know, throughout the city and the county offices, as well as distributing them to some of our other vulnerable populations. It depends. And so we tried to get it good for a year. The last time it was good for something like 6 months. And so, yes, that's an issue to make sure that we don't get an excessive amount all at once.
Okay.
Yes,
Good.
we'll be looking at that.
Great, great. Because I just, a few days ago was going
Right.
through the at-home tests I have, and I realized that some of them that I felt like I didn't purchase all that long ago were expired. So,
Right. And
once-
it's in small print, at least
Yeah.
the ones. Yeah, right.
yes. So I had to look closely, and I thought I only bought that 3 months ago, and it's already,
Right.
expired. So, just want to make sure that we are using our resources the best way. We don't end up purchasing things that then expire before we're able to get it out to the community. So, other than that, I think that's all the questions I have. Alderwoman Gracia, I will recognize you to close. You are muted.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. I would just ask for your favorable consideration for Board Bill number 11.
Great. Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Oh, we need a motion and a second.
Oh, sorry. I'm jumping ahead of myself. I'll entertain a motion to pass out Board Bill 11 with the do pass recommendation.
So moved.
Second.
Previous roll.
Hearing no objections to previous roll, Board Bill 11 passes with the do pass recommendation.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And thank you for your time, Craig.
No, thank you. Appreciate it.
Sure thing. So, Madam Clerk, Nancy Cross with the mayor's office is having difficulty. Her login doesn't seem to be giving her access to speak. And Dr. Scoggin is running a few minutes late. So I guess if anybody wants to take a break and get a glass of water, take a
Okay, Madam Chair, I will move Nancy Cross over to the panelists so he'll be able to speak.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Nancy, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you and I can see you all now.
Okay.
I
good.
don't see Yusuf, but I believe he's supposed to be on as well.
Yes, he's running a few minutes late. He said, do you
Okay.
think it would you like to start, or would you prefer that I just take a quick 5-minute recess?
I think you could take a 5-minute recess because this is your meeting and I think you want to ask questions and probably from him and then me in the backup in case, so that's fine.
All right, we'll take a quick break for 5 minutes and come back at 3:50. Okay, it looks like we have everyone we need on the Zoom now, so we can come back to the meeting. We are going to hear from Director Dr. Yusuf Skagen on the allocation of ARPA funding for homelessness. Dr. Skagen, are you ready to present?
Sure.
Good
Absolutely.
to see you.
Great seeing you as well, and all of the committee members here today. Appreciate this opportunity. Would you like me to start?
Please do.
All right. Just giving a little bit of context, obviously, the Board of Aldermen passed resources, some of which were allocated to the Department of Human Services last year pursuant to execution of a number of categories of service, some of which were more emergent than others, but all of them were really focused on addressing the holistic needs for both unhoused and housing unstable individuals. And so over the winter, a few days after I started, we did execute a PSA that made decisions on the first tranche of those ARPA funding decisions that allowed us to have additional resources to support emergency shelter and a whole host of other sources. We have also, in that process, learned quite a bit, one of which was that we needed to continue to develop relationships and build capacity with a variety of stakeholders in the community to support proposals that would render on the objectives that we know were necessary, particularly in a couple categories, one of which was a safe haven and a few other categories. And so we were able to solicit feedback and proposals for some of those missing categories that did not have sufficient proposals in that first round. Those decisions were weighed in upon this month. And so those contracts are in the negotiation. So currently we have contracted a total of over 40 contracts, or actually 38 contracts. And then there are a couple categories in which there's legal guidance that's being provided. Our office standardly has not executed on purchasing of buildings. And so there's certainly some legal guidance necessary in the execution of some of those contracts. But I think what we're seeing from these projects is twofold. One is that these resources are going to great use, and they are providing a level of service that's unprecedented in the community in the way that they're being provided. The majority of our sheltering and other housing services have been rendered for the unhoused on the emergency shelter side have been in a congregate nature, and subject to the pandemic and the need to provide additional space, those individualized settings were more appropriate, and those are much more costly. Without these resources, those would not have been able to be afforded. And so we've been able to continue what had been operating at a few sites in order to do that. Additionally, we were able to bring on overflow spaces over the winter time, which have now allowed us to continue even into these warmer summer months. And so a couple sites that were standardly would have shuttered as the winter season had come to an end are continuing through August. So we have a couple sites, one Asbury and another in Union, operating to make sure that there is a day cooling operation and as well as night cooling operation in additional shelter placement for individuals in the community who need that. So that is helpful as well. I'll talk to you a little bit about also the permanent side of things, because I know that there's a lot of focus on emergency shelter, but there are two equations to the homeless status issue. One is that we need to prevent the number of people who are falling into homelessness. And then secondly, we need to provide permanent housing placement for those who might otherwise be in shelter or out generally in the community. And I'll talk to a little bit about both of those. Many of you all are aware of the dollars that have been utilized over the period of the pandemic, first under the CARES Act, other federal dollars, and now emergency rental assistance dollars to help support households and preventing folks falling into eviction status. That helps us tremendously. That allowed for approximately $9 million to be spent under the first rental assistance package. And now $12.44 million is being deployed subject to that. As may have been communicated, there's a dashboard that has been put on the city's website to give more indication as to where those dollars are going and to what zip codes and in what dollar amounts across the region. That rental assistance dollars or under the Emergency Rental Assistance Program has been executed in partnership with St. Louis County so as to provide some synergy around reaching the households who are most in need. And that is helping us to support thousands of households who might otherwise be evicted. When we're looking at the overall eviction data, it also shows that we've reduced evictions subject to the deployment of these resources by over 80%. That makes a significant impact within the community and also to stabilize households and children who are in school, et cetera. Knowing that we only received $12.44 million of the second round of emergency rental assistance, and knowing that the state has had a significant amount of resources available, and we're looking for partners within the state to help execute where high needs have been expressed. We did have conversations with MHDC pursuant to accessing those resources, and were approved to receive and to locally administer here in St. Louis up to $25 million of resources, which will be deployed in $5 million intervals to the city of St. Louis. And we look forward to executing on the deployment of those resources as those have to be spent by September of this year. Additionally, the Treasury Department outlined a reallocation opportunity from communities across the entire country. And we did ask for up to $10 million, and we're waiting on approval in that arena as well. Those dollars could be spent up to the end of the year. That would allow us to do, if approved by those Treasury dollars, allow us to use our local emergency rental assistance allocation directly from the federal government. Would allow us to stage those out a little bit further down the road if necessary, so that we could continue to support people with this needed support over a period of time. So that's, again, the prevention side of things. One of the key components, however, when we think about sheltering, is also wanting to make sure that we get people out into permanent housing opportunities. And knowing that rent is increasing and affordable housing, quality affordable housing continues to be a struggle, both in this community as well as nationally. We want to make sure that we are executing in ways that acknowledge that and then provide a solution for it. So our rapid rehousing programs are being executed as a part of that ARPA package to make sure that we can actually get people housed, because that's key. What we've noticed over the period of the pandemic is people's stay in shelters have been longer because they haven't been able to access permanent housing. And so we need to make sure that we are not just building more shelter, because shelter itself is not a solution. It's only part of a necessary system. But permanent housing being the most humane, the most valuable in terms of stabilizing people and their families. And so we're deploying those resources, and we will be looking to do more of that. And that's really building off the success of the Housing Surge program, which housed over 100 households in 100 days. We'll be doubling down on that, utilizing the information that we've learned subject to those project performance to make sure that we house more individuals. Another piece of this is strengthening our partnerships across sectors. The Continuum of Care is one such partner, and it's also within city government. And so we have been meeting various departments here in city government to talk through the intersection of all of our work to make sure that our collective impact is really rendered in a strategic way that proves community benefit. And some of those involved new resources coming to the table or new ways of identifying challenges and ultimately providing solutions. I'll touch on one particular topic in which there are some new resources, and that includes in Community Development Administration. There were home ARPA dollars that were deployed to that department to support bringing on new resources and opportunities for those who are potentially unhoused. And again, when we talk about the affordable housing space, we're looking to bring forward more affordable housing subject to the over $10 million that has been afforded there. And a plan has been released. There's been a survey that's been issued, and there's been quite a bit of feedback that's been garnered there. And CDA, along with the Department of Human Services and the COC, have been in discussion relative to the use of those dollars. Again, utilizing data to make sure that we are filling in gaps. There are a lot of gaps, but we want to prioritize those who are most in need. Another space is to make sure that our partnerships with key stakeholders are in place. And so we've had several conversations with the Housing Authority here in the city of St. Louis to really do what is necessary to understand the overlap between the people that we serve, both to mitigate any displacement of people, but also to build on partnerships. So for those who are not aware, HUD really encourages these sort of relationships. And last year, about a year or so ago, a year and a half ago, they issued what were called emergency housing vouchers to communities, housing authorities, to be in partnership with Continuum of Care to make sure that those referrals were made. And so our office, working with the Continuum of Care, did execute on referring to the over 161 vouchers that have been issued to the Housing Authority here in the city of St. Louis. We look forward to growing such partnerships, learning from what is happening in terms of how rapidly folks are getting into those units to strategically move forward. We're also looking at furthering our sharing of data between our office and the Continuum of Care related data, and also the Housing Authority, because there are certain synergy and commonality in that space that will allow us to, again, further refine our involvement for maximal impact. So those are just a few things that are going on subject to this. I don't want to belabor and talk because I can't talk for a long period of time. There's a lot of work happening in this department. I probably should have spoke to you a little bit further about other areas of human services that are executing on certain work, but I'll defer that to potentially another discussion.
Sure, thank you so much. Do you happen to have access to the document that was provided to the HUD's committee yesterday? There were specific, everything that's been allocated, approved by the Board of Aldermen and approved by the Board of Estimate and Apportionment. If not, I'm happy to screen share with you. I think it would be helpful for the committee to hear sort of directly on what was allocated, what's been spent to date, and what the plan is for any funds that have not been expended yet.
Sure, you can, if you want to share that screen, that'd be perfectly fine.
Okay. Yikes, sorry guys. My computer is not being helpful. There we go. Can you all see that now?
Yeah, if you could blow it up, that would be helpful.
We scroll down to DHS. Okay, so I think DHS starts with rental utility assistance, and then we can walk through. Are you able to see that okay?
I can, yeah. So the rental slash utility assistance, again, goes back to the emergency rental assistance program. This is the second round of the emergency rental assistance program. Again, this is in partnership with St. Louis County. The county received approximately $30 million. We are utilizing a one vendor called Live Stories to execute on this. It provides an online platform, centralized database for folks to be supported in submitting their application. There are several community-based organizations that are also out in the community supporting individuals who need that in submitting their application. There have been approximately 2,000 households that have been served to this point, with many hundreds being served every week. And so that is what I was mentioning earlier. This data is probably about a week and a half, 2 weeks old. So every week there is at least 500,000 or 600,000, in some instances, $1 million being deployed to support these households. Our key indicators for success in this program is not just the utilization of the dollars, but also focusing them in communities that are most in need. We connect that with the data around evictions, and we also make sure that we are in connection with that data, ensuring that those community-based organizations are performing outreach in those communities to support them. I think the proof is in the pudding with regard to the success that the dollars have made generally in the region. As I indicated before, the eviction numbers are down significantly. This also coordinates with our conflict resolution organization, who is in the courts embedded to help support those households that might reach the courts, but should be really redirected to be supported where the assistance is available. One key thing that we are working, however, on is that assistance is one thing, but another thing is to get people back on their feet and support it. And so we'll be working to ensure that workforce development is integrated with those particular households so that they are able to be self-sufficient. These resources are limited in terms of the number of months that can be provided. So we have to think about the transition for those households. So that starts with our vendor having identified those who have received approximately 9 months of assistance, those community-based organizations making direct outreach to those households to support them in that supported effort. So that gives an indication there. Again, we had additional approval for resources from MHDC up to $25 million that will have to be spent by September. That is available only in $5 million increments as we spend them. And then we're awaiting word from a $10 million reallocation request from the Treasury Department. Regarding mortgage assistance, there are 3 vendors that have been selected for that. All 3 vendors have been contracted. They include Park Central Development, Salvation Army, and the Urban League. Those 3 organizations have a long history of providing this sort of support in the community, and they will be going through a training right after the holiday so as to make sure that this program is deployed in the second week of July. We want to make sure that there's no overlap between their work here locally, as well as there's no duplication of benefit in comparison to what is being deployed at the state level. MHDC is also deploying mortgage assistance, and duplication of benefit is certainly not allowed by the federal government, and we want these dollars to be deployed in a maximal way. One of the key indicators here, again, is utilizing pre-foreclosure data so that we can target communities that are most in need, recognizing that there's a gap in home ownership between African Americans and Caucasian in our area, with approximately a 30% or more differential in home ownership. Our office is also working on stabilizing home ownership through the tax relief program. Park Central Development is also involved in that, and they are They've made dozens of contacts of households to salvage people from losing those homes due to failure to pay their real estate tax. And that is also going to prevent some people from losing their home subject to the tax sale that's coming up next Tuesday. And that's what's covered in that next item. The accounting and legal compliance component, that is something that we're working with personnel subject to hiring. Those are dollars that will be drawn down. We do need additional staff. And so we've been working with that to make sure that we can get the staffing support to execute on some of that work. It's hard to see some of this other portion. If you could scroll over a little bit. Yeah. Intentional encampment. So that was a project that was awarded contingent upon identifying a location, et cetera, to a particular organization back in the winter. And they are still working subject to the conditions around what would be an allowable space or place to locate that. Certainly, as everyone is aware, the Board of Aldermen in passing the ARPA funds did restrict certain operations such as this from being in particular wards. And so we will be working with all parties involved to move things forward and make sure that these dollars either execute in this space or in another space to support the unhoused in a maximal way. Safe Haven, again, that was just brought forward in a proposal that was submitted that the PSA did weigh in on about a week or so ago. And the awarded agency will be notified shortly and contract execution so that we can bring that on board. Emergency shelter. Wow, you're scrolling to I'm glad I don't have migraines because I would go crazy right now with the screen moving so fast. Where are we? Is this a trick? What are you doing, Christine? Okay. We did the intentional encampment. So yes, again, that one we talked about. If you go further down, Safe Haven, we talked about, and then emergency shelter. As you can see, nearly 30% of the emergency shelter dollars have been utilized. Again, a lot of that focused on a lot of our winter operations. Those dollars are reimbursed dollars. So month over month, you will continue to see those figures be spent down. I will highlight, however, there is approximately a 1.5, almost $1.7 million portion of that that is focused on not just providing immediate service, but also thinking about how we bring on more for our community as we know that there have been gaps in services. And the example being, we have an organization that is a longstanding great supporter of emergency shelter in the community that would like to expand its operation twofold. One, to both serve more people, but then secondarily, to provide 24-hour operation, which this community in whole really needs. As a 24-hour operation of sheltering provides a better space and place and model for supporting households and building relationship to get them to, again, a permanent housing placement. So
Dr. Falcon, I just wanted to apologize. My computer is not happy with me, so I'm not trying to give you a seizure or make our report to the committee more difficult. I was trying to scroll down and so bear with me.
No problem. Case management is a category that is helping to provide those supported wraparound services. And you will start to see some of those dollars drawn down. Again, some of the contracts through negotiation and identifying how they will intersect with other services was really had to be ironed out so that those dollars were not being utilized inappropriately or without much benefit. The United Way that is already underway, that is helping to support some of the operations in coordination with Live Stories, who is our emergency rental assistance vendor, as well as connecting in on some of that cross-referencing with the state, again, to prevent any sort of duplication of benefit. We do need to make sure that With a lot of these services, there is an opportunity for that to be tracked and folks to be referred accordingly. We want to make sure there's real-time information subject to that. And so the United Way will be operating a hotline and a centralized intake. There'll also be some additional pieces that come up out of that operation that we've been in discussions with them and negotiating over the last month and a half, so as to bring even more benefit to this space than was originally thought of when this RFP was issued. And so stay tuned for that. Wraparound services, again, that is being deployed in some of the categories. Some of the organizations that are operating in other spaces are using this as a supported arm of the work that they're doing in those categories to provide that sort of wraparound services, more comprehensive supports. Oh, let's say here. One thing I want to mention here is the rapid rehousing. As you noted, there's only a little bit more than half of those dollars were initially awarded. We only had received 3 proposals, just shy of $1.7 million being requested for that rapid rehousing. So we reissued the nearly $1.3 million for proposals to satisfy that full $3 million allocation. In doing so, we have identified more proposals for the full allocation of all of those dollars. Just to give you context, the Housing Surge program that had been developed and deployed, housing 100 households in 100 days, took about $3 million to support these households for over up to 24 months of assistance. And so we look forward to this project with these vendors being able to deploy similar results with a few tweaks based upon what we've learned, but additionally really focus in on some other communities' best practice to make sure that we can truly implement a housing first and rapid housing first of these individuals who are in need. One of the great opportunities of ARPA funds, it does not come with the same restrictions of standard homeless HUD dollars. Standard homeless HUD dollars have a lot of restrictions and there can be a lot of bureaucracy to how people get prioritized. That is not necessarily required under the ARPA funds. And so particularly in the rapid rehousing space, we're looking to do something a little different so as to speed up what is necessary to support households in getting permanently housed. And I think that's generally it at this point. Folks have already heard about the targeted cash assistance. Those dollars have been fully allocated and almost fully spent. We're in the wind down there. There have been a number of communications subject to how that's benefited individuals, households across this community. Truly a phenomenal effort in doing something that had not been done here in this community. And so look forward to figuring out how what has been learned there can help to support similar activities going forward.
Great, thanks so much again for going over that with us. I'd like to open up to the committee for questions. Alderwoman Green.
Thank you, and thanks for taking the time to talk to us today. Looking at that spreadsheet, I have to say I'm kind of concerned with how little has been spent down at this point in time. And I'm just wondering if you could walk us through kind of the RFP process and what is taking so long to allocate these funds or get them out to service providers. I mean, we're getting pretty close to it being a year since this funding was allocated.
Yeah, so when I came into this role, the RFPs proposals were just due a few days after I came on board. I've been here approximately 7 or more months. And in that deployment, there had to be some negotiation. There were also various components. I just want to give a little context here. The work that the Department of Human Services performs in partnership with the organizations in the community are not projects that you can allocate resources and those dollars are spent overnight. These projects, in many instances, are designed and were proposed to be spent down over 1 to 2 years. And so the spend down could be as little as 1/12% of their allocation if it was over a 1 year period of time, or as little as 5% if their allocation was contracted to be spent down over a 2 year period of time. So just to give a little context there about exactly what we're kind of discussing. We have been working through a process to ensure that we can get contracts online. And so I've discussed that with staff around how we can make sure that on the front end of RFPs being issued, we have PSA and ENA factored into how those things are then fully approved and therefore allowed to be executed in contract. But I would also say that in contract negotiation, it does rely upon both the city as an administrator of these resources and the organizations in modifying budgets that might have to be amended subject to any sort of changes that might be necessary subject to their award. I have no concern that these dollars will be utilized and that they're going to great benefit. I think what is just important to understand is that the spend down is very particular to the type of services being rendered. Rapid rehousing, as I indicated, a little north of half of those dollars were even asked for in the initial RFP last winter. It wasn't until just a few weeks ago that we got proposals to allocate the remaining funds. And so we look forward to those contracts being able to be deployed for that second half and getting those dollars out the door. It's also important to recognize that capacity is a challenge, not just within government, but also within the community. Nonprofits have struggled in maintaining staff and or bringing on new staff to do, in some instances, expanded service. And this work is not very easy. And I'll just give you some examples. It takes some time, particularly in the rapid rehousing and some of those spaces, to get people leased up when there's a very, very tight market subject to available units, particularly for the populations that we serve who may have evictions in their history or who have very constrained incomes, which may not be the most ideal for some landlords in approving. So what we are also doing is internally hiring staff that can execute on some of these issues. One of which is improving our connection with landlords and expanding direct relationships that will bring on more identified affordable units. Again, working with other departments who have already devised relationships in that regard, and then working with the continuum of care to ensure that landlord engagement events that have been done in the past actually deliver on specific units and specifically identified parties that have units available that will lease to the people that we serve. So hopefully that gives a little context, Alderwoman Green, about many of the varying issues that come along with utilizing these dollars, but I have all the confidence in the world that these resources will be executed and brought to bear as we deploy them.
Okay, so my understanding from that is in the first round, we basically didn't get enough applications to be able to.
In some categories, that's true, yes.
Okay. And, but through this second round, we now feel like we have enough folks to fulfill everything that we're trying to do.
Right, in some of those categories, correct. Rapid rehousing being a particular one.
Okay.
And then also working with organizations as they bring on staff and they build capacity to actually perform on some of the work that they propose.
Okay. And as you know, this money makes it into the hands of service providers now, what benchmarks are we setting up as a city for gauging how successful this is? And you know, is there going to be some kind of dashboard on the city webpage, or how are we going to know that we're having our desired impact?
So there are a variety of categories, and so there are different metrics for each category. I would just say in whole, we have two things that we're concerned about. One is housing people and preventing people from becoming homeless. So if I could wrap it up in a nutshell, it's that. And so when we go look at mortgage assistance, we're trying to prevent folks. So we are targeting those households that are in pre-foreclosure status. We are looking at those communities that have been disproportionately impacted. That's where we're targeting. So not only just spending the dollars, but them going to the hands of the people that need it. So that's one. And there will be information subject to that about zip codes, where the dollars are going, so on and so forth.
Okay. Sorry, go ahead.
And when it comes to the rental assistance space, there is a dashboard that's already on the city's website that can provide information about who's being served, how many are applying, what's the turnaround time for those applications being supported, so on and so forth. When it comes to the rapid rehousing and other homeless dollars, it is both about providing capacity to serve the emergency needs of those. So that means reducing the number of people that are on the streets, both by providing emergency assistance, whether that's a sheltering operation or bridge housing, or conversely, reducing the number of people, the number of days of people being in shelter as we permanently house individuals. So we also did, the mayor's office did sign on to the House America goal, and that is to do two things. One is to build more affordable housing, and then secondly is to house individuals. Our goal for bringing on more affordable housing was a goal of 150 new affordable units. So that's one. And that was outlined in a presentation nationally for HUD under the Housing America initiative last week. So that deals with building out, but then we're also looking to house as many as 800 individuals this year, both through activities relating to general continuum of care dollars, our work on our emergency rental assistance dollars as we transition people, as well as the ARPA funds. So those are generally how we gauge success.
Okay.
And in each contract and in each category, specific numbers and metrics are assigned.
Okay. I have a bunch of questions here. I'm trying to organize them here in my brain. First thing I'll say is, you know, one of the things that I've been noticing more of in the community that I represent is folks who I think are becoming unhoused because their rental rates are going up pretty quickly. Maybe they've been on a month-to-month lease, and now the landlord has realized that they can charge $200 or $300 or $400 or $500 more a month for the apartment that they had been renting, and so folks are very quickly finding themselves without access to affordable housing or housing that was in the same, you know, rental rate that they had before. And so I'm just curious about how we address that, because it's not really a rental assistance, like it doesn't really, you know, meet rental assistance guidelines, but I think that some of the folks that we are seeing on the streets now, particularly, you know, around the South Grand Business District, some of those folks are coming because of that sort of situation.
Yeah, so rental rates increasing year over year about 20% here locally and also nationally. And then of course, in some parts of the nation, as much as 50 or 60% increases. In addition to general inflation costs, cost of food and other commodities, gas prices, et cetera, all contribute to the challenges. Also, right in the middle of the pandemic, there were rate increases from the various utility companies as well. And so there are a lot of things that are pinching at the pocketbooks of households throughout our region. Our office is doing all that we can to support people in a variety of ways, but it is a larger problem for which we don't necessarily have all the controls pursuant to. What we have, however, engaged in is working with Tower Grove. Tower Grove CDC is one of the awarded entities, and that allows for them to more robustly build out their network of affordable housing unit providers and landlords, and also a website that supports folks being aware of those houses and those units. And so that is something that we are engaging. And again, with the hiring of a staff person internally, building out further relationships and working with Tower Grove CDC, we hope to address some of those challenges. But gentrification, increased pricing overall is certainly a pressure that I think we all feel. Some folks who are on the ownership side of things may benefit, while those who are renters often struggle. I think the last statistic I showed or that I read is that approximately 60% of those households in the city of St. Louis are renters. And so we have a disproportionate share of both renters and a disproportionate share of those who struggle with a lower income. So I think we have to have a broader conversation about what are some of the steps, both legislatively, policy-wise, and otherwise, to help to support these households, as well as how departments of human services or other departments might be better supported in the budget to help execute on these things, because these issues are not going away. I'll give you two more examples. As our office looks more deeply in this information, is that part of the issue is private equity buying many units. St. Louis has been an affordable housing region and understood as such from a lot of national players for quite some time. We have a housing stock that is remarkable compared to a lot of communities and what you can purchase. And what we've seen in terms of low interest rates over the last many years has perversely incentivized private equity to get into this space. If you can get a property at 2.5–3% interest rate, and then you can turn around and jack up the rents like many of the landlords have. And we've been able to chart this in data where they will buy up several properties in the same area and create their own comparables so as to be able to change the entire market. That's what's happening here. And then we also know that certain landlords and players in this space also are evicting at a much higher rate. So out-of-town landlords are evicting at a higher percentage than are local landlords. So again, this is a deeper conversation. We have a wealth of data around this subject matter, and we'd be happy to be in conversation about how we right-size this, not just in the immediate, but in the long term as well.
Would you be willing to share that data with members of this committee? I'd really be interested in diving into that a little bit more.
Yeah, we have access to that data, and we can give some report outs on some of those particulars.
Okay, great. Because the other thing you said is that as a part of the Rehouse America, we're creating 150 new affordable units. That number seems very low to me. The Affordable Housing Report Card, said that we need 35,000 between St. Louis City and St. Louis County. I mean, I know personally in the 15th Ward, if the redevelopment of Fanning Middle School goes through, we're adding 31 affordable units just through that, project. It seems like we need to have a much bigger goal than that in order to truly address what's happening in our market right now.
I think and let me be clear, the goal of House America has some specifics around what would be eligible or not. So you have both units that we need to keep online, as well as we need to produce more affordable units. And I would agree that the level of financial investment that is out there to tackle what it was identified in the affordable housing report card, it doesn't match up. And that is not the case just here locally, but that's also nationally. And so again, it does deserve further discussions around how do we provide more supports to bring on more affordable housing? How do we also make sure that our zoning and other systems, our incentives, et cetera, focus in a similar pattern? So there's a lot to chew on there.
Yeah. So the other, I'll wrap it up here in a minute, but another question I have is, do we have an idea at the moment how many beds we've had funded in the past that aren't currently being funded, or what is the need versus what do we have in place at the moment?
And I'm just to clarify, specifically what type of beds. We have all sorts of beds.
I would focus it on emergency shelter.
So in terms of emergency shelter beds, pre-pandemic, the majority of our sheltering was congregate in nature, meaning that there were large spaces, there were multiple cots or bunk beds, et cetera, where people were being served. Obviously, such proximity and setup wasn't ideal in mitigating transmission of the coronavirus. So that's why the CARES dollars, ESG additional dollars from the federal government, as well as ARPA dollars to help to support additional space where folks could be served. What that meant was those congregate shelters where social distancing was required, there was a reduction in capacity there to allow for that social distancing. That was then offset by additional resources being able to render new beds elsewhere in a non-congregate setting or in socially distanced ways. That then allowed for us to have more shelter beds available during the pandemic and at this time than we did at this time prior to the pandemic. So we have more beds than we had before. An example being, there has not been a time in recent history where we have had a continuation of overflow beds from the winter into the summer months. And that is something that is being rendered in partnership with City Hope at a couple of the sites, which otherwise would have shuttered likely at the end of March. We're continuing those through August. So these dollars are helping us to bring on the supports in a continual fashion. So there are more beds available now than there were pre-pandemic. But again, beds only speak to one piece of the equation.
Well, that's my next. That was my next question is,
right.
So for folks that are not ready to be in housing, it's not a good fit for them to be in housing, what mobile outreach is happening right now?
So there are a variety of things happening in that space. So our office, through the allotment of additional outreach workers, we are hiring many outreach workers. Our outreach staff has more than doubled, and we have more that are being hired to do a few things. One is identify all of the sites across the entire city of St. Louis, not just in location, but also being very specific about who's there and what are their particular needs. And then lastly, are they connected to our prioritization list for housing? That was not the practice prior to me coming on board here. And that, unfortunately, the absence of such doesn't allow for you to systematically understand the issue and directly target and address that issue. Example being, there was a woman who passed away due to a health matter over the winter, not due to hypothermia, but due to a health matter. And she had not been in connection with the prioritization list or any homeless service system for 3 years. And the problem is because there was not systematic outreach, although she had been outreached by someone. She had a tent and people knew exactly where she was, but there was no systematic outreach about who she was, and she certainly was not on the prioritization list where housing was available, permanent housing, not just shelter. And so that's why outreach is so important to address those folks who may not come into shelter. Additionally, to your other question about right setting or the sort of right conditions for people who might not otherwise do well in some standard shelters. That's why Safe Haven project is being pursued and should be online shortly. And that's why Bridge Housing and other projects similar, bringing on new partners to execute on this work is critical to doing so. I will also add that our department has evaluated and asked all of the shelters to provide information about who is on their banned list. There's been a lot of discussion about people being banned from shelters and therefore not able to access those shelters. What we have found is that there's mixed information in that regard. Some individuals are banned, and quite frankly, in some instances, for the right reasons. If those parties are violent and they threaten to harm others or have harmed others, then there may be a reason to ban that person for a period of time from that place. But in best practice, what those policies are, who those individuals are, is important to understand. Additionally, integrating that into a system so that as to make sure that when people say that I can't go to this particular shelter because I'm banned, cross-referencing that to verify whether that's the case or not is important, because in many instances over the winter, as well as up until just this past week, people will believe that they're banned or will report that they're banned and they're not banned.
Yeah. So how many outreach workers do you currently still need to hire?
When it's all said and done, we will have a total of approximately 12 outreach workers operating out of our department alone. We have over half of those staffed now.
Okay. And I think I talked to you about this previously. You know, when Irene was here right before the pandemic, we were looking at putting a dedicated social worker or outreach worker at the Carpenter Branch Library to address, you know, some of our you know, unhoused and folks that are struggling with addiction that are kind of in the South Grand, you know, South Gravois corridor. Is there any further thought about a collaboration with some of our libraries to house outreach workers that, you know, might then have a specified area and can really get to know the people and the population that's in that area that they're servicing?
Yeah, we are certainly open. So when I've spoken to Waller, who's over the library system, about stronger partnership in that vein. We've also I've had experience with this as the St. Louis County Library actually has social workers within those libraries. So Waller and I have talked about an opportunity to potentially model something similar at the libraries here in the city of St. Louis. So those discussions will be ongoing. Particular outreach from our staff in locations that have been identified is something that we will certainly add as identified and spoken to for our staff, and we will make sure that we deploy them in that vein.
All right. think that's probably good on my questions for now. I may have more, I'm not going to say I may have more in the future. I will have more in the future. So I will
point
reach out.
one more point I would mention though is that there are various areas within our community that have infrastructure already built out, meaning that they are very organized. They may have a community improvement district, they may have a special business district, they may have a neighborhood organization of some sort that understands the needs of their community very intimately and or is resourced in some sort of way to address some of those matters. One example being the Central West End has a number of off-duty police officers that have been operated for many, many years as supported by special business districts and community improvement districts in the area. As of last year, they brought on a couple outreach workers that have been providing outreach services throughout the corridor. They coordinate with our office, both from a data perspective and otherwise, to again ensure that those parties are connected to our prioritization list and that we are making sure we're making the most efficient and best use of our staff for us to not be overlapping each other. When you don't have coordination, which was the case generally in the past, you end up getting a lot of duplication, and then you end up missing some areas. And I'll give specifics on that. There was a lot of outreach happening in areas where a lot of outreach workers potentially live and feel comfortable, whereas in other parts of our community, particularly in North St. Louis, the outreach was not as viable and as often. And so what we have been doing is making sure we not only, again, identify places, who's there, but also track the frequency at which outreach is being made in those particular areas and deploying the right type of outreach. We talk about outreach as if it is a one size fits all, but there are certain encampments in which drug activity or addiction is a significant issue, whereas another encampment may not have the same challenges. And so we have to deploy the appropriate resources with the partnerships and expertise that help to address that. So we work with Steve Parrish and Rachel Winograd relative to those areas where opiate addiction is significant. And we deploy some of the BHR outreach and also BJC behavioral health outreach in some of those other areas. So that's just giving a little bit of a window into some of the more sort of detailed thought behind how outreach is being deployed and what services are rendered.
Okay, that's appreciated. And I think, for the example, like with South Grand, I mean, we have a business district that stops where the biggest need is, and we are trying to expand it south, and Schnucks is not being a good corporate partner in allowing us to do that so that we can provide the resources in that area. But I do think that if we were able to do that the business district and our CDC at minimum would be willing to help pool some resources if they had some support from the city as well to do a dedicated outreach worker for that strip that could potentially be housed in Carpenter Branch. But I think the city needs to also help as the convener in these areas where this is possible and kind of do the training on what this could look like. I've had this conversation with many of these groups. We have an SBD there as well, and I think it's hard sometimes to get folks that are accustomed to using police as a response to people who are unhoused to be able to visualize what a different system could look like. And I think having the city as that convener of sort of training some of these groups or providing that technical assistance, I think could make them be the nudge that some of them need to move forward in trying to implement some of these plans. And I'm willing to help or work on that in any way, shape, or form to convene some of this. But thank you so much for answering my questions today. I will turn it over to somebody else because I'm sure that there are other committee members who have questions as well. But thank you for taking the time.
Alderman Gunther, do you have any questions?
Thank you, Chairwoman. The Alderwoman from the 15th asked a whole lot of them, and a lot of the ones that I was thinking as well. I guess just a couple questions, though. Dr. Scoggins, thank you for being here. But of our existing service providers, I have two in my head. Do you know of any that have reached out to you that are considering no longer doing their walk-in shelters, which would kind of add to the lack of walk-in services that we have? And the one that I'm specifically thinking of is Peter and Paul down in Soulard, where there seems to be some reorganization, but that is a walk-in shelter that services a whole lot of people down on my side here. So have you heard any rattles about that? And I have to take this call, so I'm going to listen. Thank you. And that'll be my only question.
Okay. So we're in conversation with all of the providers, Peter and Paul being one of them. Peter and Paul is going through a strategic sort of focus in its future. And that includes sort of changing their model to do a couple things. One is to expand the number of people that it serves, and also to go to a 24-hour shelter. And so we did award Peter and Paul resources to help identify a location and to provide those supports along the lines of their strategic focus for the future. And so we look forward to supporting that. I am not aware that services are being considered to be cut in the immediate. We do know that providers are wanting to make sure that they're expanding services in a holistic way, and that may mean at some point there's transition from one location to another. But I would reserve any further comment regarding that to more information shared.
Looks like we may have lost Alderman Gunther. So I'll move on to Alderwoman Middlebrook. Alderman Gunther, we can come back to you. Alderwoman Middlebrook, do you have any questions for Dr. Scoggins?
No, Madam Chair, I don't have any questions. Thank you.
Sure. Alderman Todd, do you have any questions?
No, Madam Chair, thank you.
Sure. I see Alderwoman Clark Hubbard is on the call. Alderwoman, do you have any questions for Dr. Scoggins?
No, thank you.
Sure thing. I'm going to ask a few myself. Thanks for spending so much time with us this afternoon. I really appreciate it. One of the things I heard you mention when you were giving your presentation was that you were really looking to strengthen partnerships within not just city government agencies or departments, but also with the continuum of care. And just, I guess my experience so far is there's been a lot of friction between the Department of Human Services and COC. So I'm hoping maybe you can articulate what your plan is to help maybe smooth those relationships and make sure that the COC feels like they are a part of the decision-making process and an organization or entity that you value.
So our ability to execute on the work here in the Department of Human Services is contingent upon strong partnerships, as our office is not a direct facilitator of the work. We do not have staff that run shelters. We do not have staff that directly operate housing programs, et cetera. We are providing outreach because there's just not enough outreach happening in the community in a coordinated and consistent fashion. And that is really where we've been expanding operations, working with the continuum of care in the county prior to coming here to the city of St. Louis, as well as previously being on the board of the COC in the city, and currently still on the board of the COC in the county. I recognize how interwoven that relationship must be. It is also the case that we have to orient people to understanding what are the goals and objectives of what we're providing, and that the issues before us should not be wrapped into a space of fighting one another because one does not get everything that one desires, or that that particular interests are not necessarily being satisfied. We generally understand that this issue of housing is something that we don't necessarily have all of the controls relative to. When we think about those who are unhoused, they are unhoused because of a lot of failed systems. And part of the challenge is to make sure that people are aware that emergency shelter is not the only avenue, the only support that's necessary to address this matter. One is we must better understand the data. And in my discussions with the COC, that is one of the focus areas, and being on the system performance committee, helping to provide more insight as to what we're looking for and how we can utilize that data to make more concrete decisions that make an impact. So that's one thing, is really making sure our office is involved in the various committees, is supporting the data around the work, is provided feedback from the continuum of care about any gaps. Another issue is making sure that the continuum of care as a whole is a broader cross-section, as is really identified and thought of by HUD, generally speaking, making sure our school districts, our housing authority, and a whole host of other players are at the table. And that has not, in the recent history, been as robust as it needs to be, considering the size of our continuum of care, and also considering the magnitude and the complexity of the issues that face the city of St. Louis. And so we have to look at those intersection points. We're not going to be able to, just from a simple nonprofit service provider, be able to solve the challenges that we face. So one is orientation around what that looks like, and also sort of moving forward as the new administration looks to take a much more holistic approach to addressing these challenges. There is a lot of sort of open wounds and grievances subject to a variety of calls that I've been on. I'm sure staff here in this department have either been a part of prior or currently feel the tension. But I do believe that there is a new avenue forward as we are really chipping away at bringing forward projects that make sense, that execute on the ultimate goal, as we orient people and we bring those players to the table. Again, I've talked about the discussions that have been happening with the Housing Authority. We just had another large discussion that was convened by the United Way yesterday. And so things are moving in the right direction. These challenges that we face have been here for quite some time. I've been a city resident for a long time. My family grew up in the Ville. And so I am keenly aware of the issues here in St. Louis. And as an African-American male, living in the mighty 26, we have a broad cross-section of well-to-do families, but then we also have families that are struggling. And so the degree to which we have to really understand what are the feeders into this space and bring together people from who all have, I think, generally speaking, the same intentions, but may look at the issues from different orientation to the table to contribute to the solution. That also includes making sure that we have people at the table who are representative of the population being served, particularly for those who are subject matter experts, meaning people who had lived experience. The majority of our street unhoused are people of color and are single African-American males. We have to have a discussion about the racial disparities that exist within the work and within the space of unhoused, housing instability, eviction rates, and all across that spectrum. And once people get outside of sort of just our sort of narrow lane of focus and really understanding this from a broader perspective, then we can really tackle equity issues in ways that aren't just taglines, but they actually demonstrate measurable impact. And that can only be happening subject to those partnerships.
Thank you for that. And I guess building on that, before I move on to the next question, I would really like to work with you more closely on providing constructive criticism to the organizations that are at the table doing outreach, and also for the Department of Human Services and the administration to feel comfortable addressing constructive criticism and answering questions. Please let me know if I can help facilitate that, because I think the longer the relationships stand where they are, the more problematic it is, mostly affecting unhoused folks. And so you mentioned, orienting people to the goals and objectives that the Department of Human Services has. How do you make sure that it's client-centered? So you mentioned the fact that most of the unhoused individuals in the city of St. Louis, and I agree, I think the data shows it, are single Black men. How are you ensuring that they are at the table for setting priorities and goals, and also that the COC and other advocacy organizations are also helping set those priorities?
We are encouraging, and we've done this, and when I first started here in the following month, went to the COC meeting. I think it was the selection of board members was being brought forth. And through that process and that election, I identified what no one at the table had clarified, and that is that there was racial disparity in representation on the executive board for the continuum of care. The decision-making table was imbalanced. We have been working closely with HUD and the continuum of care to go through some governance changes that have been identified as concerns and conflicts of interest relative to what is happening at the COC to improve this work. We are also encouraging the advocacy committee and also the lived experience representative on the board to not just be a token. And there's been feedback that position has been tokenized, and we need to make sure that body is not just represented by one person who does not represent the bulk of the unhoused or the people who are street homeless or has had a recent history of homelessness, but is inclusive of a larger body that is representative, that can then bring forward the information that would be instructive to how this work can work better. And so there are some challenges pursuant to that, however. Volunteering time for an unhoused person to provide feedback and not be paid for that is an issue. And so we're looking to bring forward stipends for unhoused to participate in a committee so that they can provide feedback and be paid for that. And so that is another way in which you get direct feedback from those who otherwise are struggling just to get by and figure out where their next meal is going to come from, or where they might rest their head for that evening.
Okay, I appreciate that. And I sit on the advocacy committee of the COC, and I was not aware that that was something that had been brought up. So I hope we can continue to talk about that. See a couple of follow-up questions. I guess overarchingly, the RFP process, I think we all can agree, is maybe not designed exactly the way it needs to be expeditious or particularly helpful in times where we are dealing with such an influx of homelessness, not just in our city, but across the country. And I think you've articulated in many meetings that we've sat in on together that you feel like your hands are tied, and there's I think an issue in my mind with the expediency and also with the lack of transparency. So I don't know under which ordinance or policy the Department of Human Services is working under, but in the past, organizations that have been applicants have been able to participate in some way and I think what you're calling the PSA committees that consist of an appointee of the mayor, appointee of the president of the board, appointee of the comptroller, the director of the department that's receiving the funding, and then that director's appointee from that department. Can you talk a little bit about what you think is working well in that system and what could work better, and how to be more transparent in terms of making sure that to the greatest extent possible, as much information is being released to the public as possible, understanding that there are some things that can't be discussed outside of a closed session?
Yes, so I thought there are a few pieces to that. So the RFP process, being more explicit about what is desired, and certainly is something that we've been evaluating. That was also considered under the Safe Haven proposal as reissued, to be clearer as to what a safe haven is, as well as what is desired, to make sure that that's a project that is successful and meets the overall objectives. I think, I think there are a lot of things that are kind of packaged in this. One is, as I mentioned before, capacity is a challenge within organizations overall. And the number of organizations that are equipped and able to perform various tasks and bring forth various projects. And so what we really have is, one, a capacity building issue and training issue. And so we've been looking to utilize some of our training dollars to bring forth more parties to the table and build our capacity. This also dovetails into the equity issue. The majority of the organizations that are serving people in the community are not representative of administrations or organizations that are led by people that look like the people that are being served. Just to put it more bluntly, the majority of people who are unhoused in the city of St. Louis are disproportionately African American. Yet the majority, if not all, of the organizations that are funded to provide a lot of these activities are not African American.
Dr. Scoggin, I apologize. I'm just going to interrupt you quickly. I think what you're saying has absolute value, but if you could speak directly to just the RFP process and the selection committee process, I would appreciate it.
That is connected to this particular work, is that we have to build capacity in those places and spaces to diversify and bring forward many proposals. As was discussed earlier, the Rapid Housing Project only solicited 3 or so proposals that didn't even request the full amount of money allocated in that category. So what we have to do is make sure we get a number of proposals, a number of providers that are able to execute on the work. And so that is key to a lot of this, to make sure that we can move forward that process. In terms of transparency, the information could be clearer in the RFP, and we'll continue to provide more information to that. We can also do more pre-bid conferences, as some of those are already done, but we can spend more time doing those to educate people on the process. One of the key components too is training organizations on how to submit proposals, what is being looked for, et cetera. And so that will be forthcoming over the next several months to make sure that we are, again, helping to build that capacity and that muscle memory for organizations to be viable candidates moving forward. Once an RFP has been issued, however, it's a cone of silence and we're not able to discuss certain matters. Additionally, when it comes to review of proposals that are submitted, it is important that we not go down the road of any conflicts of interest, both stated or implied. Obviously, the Board of Aldermen recognizes the challenges that were brought forth over the last several weeks around conflicts of interest or activities that certainly are outside of potentially the law. Our office will never engage in that, and we will not allow for any sort of review where entities are potentially conflicted in such a review. And so We adhere to the ordinances that are on the books. We want to be as transparent as possible, but a lot of that comes prior to any RFP coming out so as to not violate any statutes.
Okay, and when you say cone of silence and you're referencing ordinances or statutes, do you have specific references to those citations, or is there a policy that you're following?
So I'll just put it simply, if a RFP is issued, any questions pursuant to the RFP are to follow the process about submitting those questions subject to what's been noted in that RFP. So if the RFP says there's emergency shelter or any number of other activities taking place, if you have a question, you can't call our office and just ask us the question. There's a process for submitting such questions, and that allows for transparency. That allows for all of those who might apply to understand what question has been asked, for that to be clarified, and for that answer to that question to be published for everyone to see. That creates fairness. That is a best practice across any provider, any funder, the mental health board, any other funder in the city government or in private philanthropic spaces perform the same way. And so that is the process by which we operate. I could tell you there have been several times in which, since I've been here at this department, in which RFPs have been open and someone is called, or someone has had a meeting and they say, oh, by the way, that RFP has X, Y, and Z, can you? And I have to refuse every time, because that is not our policy. That would not be fair to all organizations, and that would potentially provide benefit to one entity over another. And transparency is important in that process.
When you say published, do you mean you would email all of the applicants the answers to the question that was asked?
So it's issued, every person, if a question is submitted, those questions are then answered and all see what the question was and what the answer is.
Okay. And if you could, I know you indicated to Alderwoman Green that you would be sending along some data. If you could send it to the clerk of the board and to me, and then also I appreciate your answer, but I am definitely interested in finding out what policy or ordinance you're following in terms of the RFP committee process, when things are public, when things are closed. I know that for BPS related issues, there's an ordinance that is followed as well as a policy. So I'm assuming there's something similar within the Department of Human Services. And I just haven't been able to find.
Is there anything in particular that you've identified that you would like from our office that has not been provided? As again, we issue an RFP and we take those documents in. If people have questions, we follow up with those questions and we then issue a response. So, I mean, if there is anything in particular that you've identified that is somehow different than any other department, or is not a best practice in accordance with the way that other funders, I mean, I've served on the United Way board, I served on a number of boards that have been funders. I used to serve on the mental health board, all of which operate in a similar fashion.
Sure, yeah, I guess mostly just public notification that meetings are happening, when the decision-making process is a public meeting versus going into closed session. And then when documents are legally allowed to be made available to me as an elected official, to an organization, to just an individual who might file a sunshine request. And I'm happy to forward you the ordinance and the policy I have from BPS. I'm not trying to attack or be critical of the process that DHS is taking. I just think this is something overall that we need to be looking at in the city, because I just keep getting feedback from organizations and individuals, and this is not related just to this administration, but in the past, that the way that we are handling RFPs is extremely time consuming It does not allow for expediting, funding to go out into the community in a manner that we would like, and that it's very difficult for organizations and individuals and even elected officials to get the information that should be made publicly available once it is. Happy to keep having conversations and appreciate you answering questions. Just have a couple more and hopefully let you go to dinner or happy hour, whatever is next for all of you. But in the HUD's presentation, I know you only had an opportunity to look at it quickly, but you indicated, or whoever prepared the spreadsheet indicated that DHS was working with approved vendors for contract review. What does that mean in terms of a timeline, or is there no timeline when? It seems like a lot of these, there's a lot of sections that list that contracts are under review, or negotiations are being had, and then just not funding.
I would have to look at the particulars. Standardly, there's a process. RFP is issued. We meet relative to those proposals. Decisions are made on who is awarded. Notice is made to those organizations about whether they've been funded or not. If they've been funded, have they been funded at the amount that was requested? If not, or if they've submitted in their initial proposed budget something that differs from what the regulations allow, there must be amendments. There must be contract negotiation. Also, if there are particular metrics that don't match up with what is a standard for a per cost rate potentially, as what's standard across the practice, then that's something that also has to be discussed and evaluated, because obviously we have goals and objectives that we want to meet out of the resources that are being deployed. These are taxpayer dollars. We want to make sure we get the most for what it is that is being deployed, and that they're executed in an appropriate fashion. And so subject to that, it can take some time between notification about an award, preliminary award, subject to those negotiations. Some organizations are local and therefore are able to sign their contracts more, can sign their contract quickly. Other organizations have larger infrastructure outside of the state of Missouri and have to send those documents off for signature elsewhere. So when it says that they're in process, or they're in, I'm not sure exactly what terminology you use, it standardly means that either the contract has been executed or is in the process of finalizing those negotiations. As I mentioned before, of the 40 or so, approximately 37 of them are already fully executed. And so sometimes the startup and the spend down of those resources is subject to hiring by those nonprofit organizations to have the staff to execute on that particular work. If they don't have the staff, they can't spend, and certainly we would not allow for spend down of resources for which there's no one being served.
Okay, and so that's when you would possibly reissue an RFP to reallocate the money to make sure it's just not sitting there and has the ability to be put into the community.
Yes, twofold. So we would reissue an RFP if there were line items, like was the case for rapid rehousing, in which there weren't enough proposals to utilize or award for that full category. There's also the case that if an organization has been fully executed and awarded a contract, that if there are several months that go past and they have not been utilizing those resources, they have not executed on the work, there are discussions to understand exactly what is the delay. And depending upon what that might mean, if they get too far into it, then that is a point in which we would consider reallocating those funds, meaning that that award could be partially rescinded or in whole rescinded and reallocated to another organization subject to potentially another RFP.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else on the committee have any other questions on this topic? I want to be respectful of everyone's time, knowing that we've been here for a couple of hours already, but Dr. Scoggin, would you be willing to come back soon and talk to us about the guidance that the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness released recently, and then HUD announced through the Biden administration that there's some pretty substantial funding coming through the COC and to the Housing Authority for housing vouchers and permanent supportive housing and other services to address unsheltered homelessness and encampments.
Yeah, we are certainly aware of all of those. In fact, we are meeting with COC participants next week, subject to some of the newer guidance that has been issued. Just to kind of give context for those on the committee as well, when it comes to engagement of encampments, our office is primarily doing outreach and connecting people to resources. When it comes to health or public safety related matters, those are under the purview of those different departments or divisions of government. And so we'll continue to coordinate and work with the parties involved, inclusive of the continuum of care, to ensure that those who are in need of service are provided such benefits.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Scoggin. Nancy Cross, I think, is still on. Nancy, I just wanted to give you an opportunity to follow up on anything we talked about.
I think that Dr. Scoggin covered everything. I think the one thing I would say is we probably can get you better information is the RFP process is long and involved, and we are aware of that, but some of that comes with HUD regulations that require us to post and notice certain ways. And some of it is long-term history as to how that's been done here. I've met with some people from other HUD agencies. They don't seem to have any shorter period of time. They were on the East Coast. So I think that's a national problem, maybe done for the right reason, but not working well for us in trying to get dollars out. But I'll defer to Dr. Scoggin, and we're more than helpful. The mayor's office is more than willing to come back and have discussion if you want to talk more about that. But it appears that that's the HUD regulations. So,
and I would only add to that that we want to streamline the process where possible. I think our local funds, we have much more latitude, but as Nancy alluded to, each funding source, particularly from HUD, has different process. So COC funds is a competitive application for which there's a different process. There's a long application that goes with that. You find out a year later, contracting of that is subject to a lot of hurdles for which we're solely dependent upon HUD to follow through with. And so there are a lot of different nuances to this that aren't as simple as one might assume.
And I also tried to get 2 alleged emergency contracts done quickly, and it involved pretty much the same process without an emergency. So it didn't really help the way that it was intended originally as we thought. So it bogged down even quicker. We said, yes, move forward with the emergency contract. Then it was, oh, you still have to do an RFP. Oh, you still have to post it for this many days. Well, that's not an emergency contract. Emergency contract means this organization has been working with you, extend it, let them get more. And we've had difficulty with that internally as well. So,
okay.
And don't forget, we're not computerized anywhere either.
Yes, I would love to learn more and continue to have conversations about how to streamline the process. Obviously, federal constraints and guidelines are important to follow to make sure we don't lose money, but to the extent we can on federal funding and also any local funding. And with that, thank you both so much for spending the better part of your afternoon with us. Do any committee members have any announcements before we adjourn? Like to excuse the Alderwoman from the 8th Ward for a necessary absence, and I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
Move to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All right.
We're adjourned. Thank you to all the committee members for your time as well.
Thank you.